This is the second in a series titled The Daily Battle, and it's all about issues Christians will have to face at some point in their lives, often on a daily or weekly basis. So this week we're looking at coping with confusion, surviving as a Christian when life just doesn't make sense, specifically when bad things happen to us and we question our faith. How are we meant to cope in these times? Well, for this sermon, you should please have with you 5 bits of paper around about this size. Please get 5 bits of paper around about this size before you start. It will help you as we go along. So yes, pause the video and go and get some of those. Now, if you've ever seen the musical Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, I can guarantee that you came out feeling upbeat. Even if you went to see it after eating a horrible meal on a horrible wet day after paying a horrific amount of money, I can guarantee that you'll have come out of the musical re-energized and feeling that all is right with the world. However, the reality is only 1% of Joseph's life was actually that upbeat. 99% of Joseph's story is actually all about everything going wrong, and Joseph probably being very confused as to why. If God was good, why was bad stuff happening to him? Why, when Joseph obeyed God, did things get worse? When God could have set Joseph free from his prison cell, why did God delay and make Joseph wait another 2 years? Yes, at one point in Joseph's life, he could look back and say things like, this was all part of God's plan, and God intended it all for good. But how did Joseph cope with the other 99% of his life? The many, many points in his life when doubts, questions, and confusion entered his mind. We need to know the answers to these types of questions. Why? Well, because Andrew Lloyd Webber's musical Joseph is not an accurate description of the Christian life. 99% of the Christian life is not all singing and all dancing. And just here are a few biblical examples to prove the point. Abraham. Now, Abraham spent 25 years without a son, despite God promising him that he'd have one. And Abraham, well, he found all this waiting difficult. The Israelites, they spent over 400 years in Egyptian slavery, despite God's good promises to them. During this time, they cried out to God, and for a long time received no answer. Job believed in a good God, and then Job had every good thing that he owned taken away. And so pretty much 99% of Job's book is of him questioning his faith and feeling despairing. Nearly every person in the Bible has had to know how to cope in these situations. And if you are a Christian, you need to know how to cope with this type of confusion too. So, here we go. Source of confusion number 1. God is good, but circumstances are bad. What I'm about to say is based on chapter 37 of the book of Genesis. So you've got your bit of paper. I'd like you to write on your first bit of paper 3 good things in your life. It can be things that you're glad about or things that you enjoy. So on my list is my family, my health, and my DVD collection of cartoons. These are things that I enjoy and I'm glad about. Now, I'd like you to get that bit of paper and I'd like you to rip it up. Just rip it up, just like that. How would you feel if you actually lost all of those things on that bit of paper, how would you feel if you lost them all in 24 hours? You'd no doubt feel bad, and your situation could be described as bad and nothing else. Now, do the sums. Feel bad plus bad situation equals God is good? Most people don't arrive at that conclusion. When we feel bad and when we're in a bad situation, the idea that God is good causes us great confusion. If God is good, why did he let this happen? If God is love, why does he let those who he loves hurt? If God is for us, why does God allow so much bad to work against us? Now, if we were to write all the good things Joseph had at the beginning of chapter 37 of Genesis, we're going to write down all the good things that Joseph had at the beginning. Well, this list would go something like this. Joseph was Jacob's son, and so a part of the Israelite people, a people who looked forward to inheriting the God's promised land. So, land, that's something good that Joseph has. Joseph was one of 12 brothers, at a time and in a culture when being part of a large family was generally a good thing. It worked to your advantage. Two things good that Joseph had. Joseph had good clothes, he had a good relationship with his father Jacob, and he had a good and promising future. Now, which of these good things did Joseph have by the end of chapter 37 of Genesis? None. Joseph's brothers united against him. Joseph's good clothes were taken away from him and then destroyed. Joseph was taken away from the promised land. Joseph was taken away from his father, and Joseph's good and promising future seemed ruined. Joseph no doubt felt bad, and his situation was bad. So how could Joseph, and how can we, deal with the confusion such bad situations cause? Is God good, or is he not? Now Joseph presumably allowed Moses, the author of Genesis, to write his biography, because Joseph's story is a great demonstration of God's goodness. Looking back on his life, Joseph could see three things. Firstly, in the bad, God worked for good. Joseph looked back and could see that God brought him to Egypt for a purpose. The purpose of blessing others in ways that he could never have done any other way. Even during your worst situations, God is working for good, even if now you can't see it. Secondly, the best good thing that Joseph had, God himself, was never taken away from him. Within the worst moments of Joseph's life, the point is repeated in the book of Genesis. The Lord was with Joseph, the Lord was with Joseph, the Lord was with Joseph. Even when everything else in your life is taken away, you still have the most important thing, God himself. Thirdly, the best was always to come. Despite Joseph's story having a tough beginning and middle, Joseph's story is always moving towards an amazing end. In the end, God fulfills his promise to Joseph, and him and his family are greatly blessed. And like with Joseph, so much of the Christian life is based on the hope that is to come. That is, the eternal hope Christians have to look forward to. Therefore, it will always do us a lot of good to keep this eternal future in mind. Tim Keller paraphrased one of Jonathan Edwards' sermons in the following way. Sorry. The Christian life, he describes it this way. Our bad things turn out for good, our good things can never be lost, and the best things are yet to come. When things get bad, remember that sentence. Our bad things turn out for good, Our good things can never be lost, and the best things are yet to come. This being said, though for 1% of his life at the end it was very easy for Joseph to say these things, we have to think about how did he survive the other 99%. Well, one key way we evaluate if something is good or not one key way we evaluate if somebody is good or not, well, it's based on their promises. A good husband keeps their promises they make on their wedding day. A good politician does what they promised in their manifesto. A good parent does what they promise to their child, and if they don't, they'll never hear the end of it. Something interesting about chapter 37 in the book of Genesis is that it's not clearly stated if Joseph's dream was God-given or not. Obviously, at the end of the story, it confirms that it was a God-given dream. But if we're reading Joseph's story for the first time, well, we wouldn't know. Perhaps one reason the God-given nature of this dream is intentionally omitted in the story is so that we, the reader, would experience what Joseph experienced. For when Joseph was a slave and a prisoner, he would no doubt have debated in his head, was the dream God-given or not? Perhaps it was just a product of his imagination. After all, nothing in his life seemed to confirm that it was true. Now Joseph's experience is not dissimilar to the experience of us all. At times we may debate in our head if the promises of God are just a product of our imagination. Perhaps the promises about the future are just wishful thinking, false hope that makes us feel better, but nothing else. Perhaps the idea of God being with me and loving me is just a nice idea that my circumstances and feelings don't back up. Perhaps the Bible is just a selection of human stories about a God who's been imagined up by human beings. After all, we can't see God, and 99% of our life isn't saturated with the miraculous. Joseph's story is a reminder that 99% of the Christian life does involve a hard struggle to keep believing God's promises. So be prepared. It's not always going to be easy. And so the only way we're going to cope with this difficult thing is if we're people of conviction. The only way we're going to cope with the confusion of life is if we're people of conviction. Like Joseph, convinced that God is good, no matter how we feel or what is happening. Like Joseph, convinced that God will be faithful to his word, no matter how many obstacles stand in the way, and no matter how long we need to wait. Convinced that the promises of the Bible are God-given, not just a product of our imagination. God has given us plenty of examples to prove that these points are true, that He is good, that He is faithful, and that His promises He will fulfill His promises. We need to be people who are convinced of these things. So, that was source of confusion number 1. God is good, but circumstances are bad. Source of confusion number 2. Obedience is commanded, but obedience goes unrewarded. Now, I'd like you to take your second bit of paper and fold it in half to make a rectangle. So, put your first bit of paper and fold it in half to make a rectangle. And then fold it in such a way that half of it is a triangle. So, something like that. Then I'd like you to fold the rectangle at the bottom, like this, upwards to make a little flap. Now fold the top peak of your triangle down so it touches the bottom of the rectangle. Excellent. Now, final step, I'd like you to screw up your bit of paper and throw it away. Now, normally when we obey commands, we expect it to go somewhere. That's why you were probably expecting your origami efforts to result in a boat or a swan. When we obey commands and it goes nowhere, we wonder, what was the point? When we obey commands and it actually makes things worse, we wonder, why did we bother? In chapter 39 of the book of Genesis, we learn that Joseph had a clear awareness of what pleased God and what did not. That's why he described going to bed with Potiphar's wife as a sin. Not just a sin against Potiphar, but a sin against God himself. And so Joseph obeys God and doesn't sleep with Potiphar's wife. But in doing so, Joseph's story goes from bad to worse. Joseph's act of obedience caused things to go downhill. Hang on a second, we say. If God commands obedience, why does God allow obedience to go unrewarded? If God delights in his people obeying him, why does obedience sometimes make our lives miserable? Such a situation must have been just as confusing for Joseph as it is for us. For example, you are honest, and yet you pay for your honesty. You serve God, and you see no results. You sincerely desire to keep living a life of faith, and yet you face more obstacles than encouragements. You do this, that, or the other, and there is no reward. Living a life of faith doesn't always seem to pay off, at least not instantly. And if you approach the life of faith like a businessman, well, you'll give up. For just picture a business meeting at the end of the financial year. How do they, at this business meeting, evaluate success? Do they count up how many times they've done the right thing? Or do they count up how many pennies they've made? Do they look at percentages related to how pure their motives were? Or do they look at the percentage of goals that they've achieved? Do they care about how many times the cleaner went about his mundane job with great sincerity? Or do they care about how successful their salesmen have been, even if they achieve that success corruptly? Despite spending many years in Potiphar's house, a business environment, Joseph did not have this businessman's outlook. In prison and in Potiphar's house, Joseph went about his job with sincerity, doing it well. Joseph gave himself to the mundane tasks that were before him, even though it went unnoticed, and even though it didn't result in him being successful. Joseph went about his job with the right motivation, the good of others. And Joseph went about his job in a godly manner, even then when this wasn't to his advantage. And did this pay off? Most of the time, no. At least not till the very end. Often much of our confusion in life comes from having a businessman's outlook. What is God's purpose for me? All I seem to do is so mundane. What is the point of everything I do goes unnoticed? Why obey God when it makes no difference? Why give when there is no reward? The only way to cope with this type of confusion is to remember that God's goal for our lives isn't success, it's godliness. You know, a CEO says to his employees, "You shall be successful because I am successful." God says to his people, "Be holy because I am holy." God's goal for our lives isn't success, it's godliness. And secondly, God's purpose for our lives is purity, not productivity. In the book of Thessalonians we read, "It is God's will that you should be sanctified." You know, God's purpose for your life has little to do with a specific goal or target He wants you to achieve. You know, He may have plans for what He wants to achieve through you, but that's His business, not ours. In the meantime, God's purpose for you and for me is that we go about our daily lives, however mundane, with the right motivation, in the right way, and with the right focus on God's glory and not our own. If you have this outlook, the same outlook as Joseph, it will help you deal with the confusion of the Christian life. The confusion and frustration of when obedience is not always rewarded, or the confusion of the times when obedience doesn't always result in something positive. If this happens, it doesn't mean you've achieved nothing. It doesn't mean God is displeased. It doesn't mean your obedience to God was pointless. It simply means you have to trust God more, leaving the ultimate end and the eternal outcome to Him. Yes, the Christian life of faith and obedience will eventually be eternally rewarded. But in the meantime, we just have to obey. And the amazing thing is that when our obedience is eternally rewarded, God awards it not in a businessman way. You know, businessmen have phrases like this: "You scratch my back, and I'll scratch yours." You know, God rewards a life of obedience in a much more gracious way. You scratch my back, and I'll book you in for a 1,000-year spa at an all-expenses-paid hotel in the most glorious place in the world. God isn't a God of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. God is a God of you scratch my back, and I'll bless you in ways that you do not deserve. And you can hardly complain when that's what you and I have got to look forward to. So thirdly and lastly, source of confusion number 3. My hopes are raised, but God seems to disappoint. Now, on a bit of paper, I'd like you to draw a circle with a small gap in it. So it should look something like this. And now in the middle of the circle, I'd like you to draw a stick man. Okay, so it should look something like this. Now, in your head, I'd like to plan your route to get this stick man out of the circle. Have you got that route? How are you going to get this stick man out of the circle? Have you got that route? Now, what would happen if I did this? Oh dear. How many of your routes to get out of this circle are now useless? How many of you have no idea how to escape? You have just felt, on a very small scale, what Joseph experienced in Genesis chapter 40. Joseph had done a good deed for one of his fellow prisoners. This prisoner would have soon have access to the most powerful man in Egypt, the king of Egypt, otherwise known as Pharaoh. By this point, Joseph had probably chalked his plan of escape on the wall of his prison cell. You know, this is me. Joseph had probably done something like this. He could probably have said to himself, well, this is me in my prison cell. And the king of Egypt, there he is outside. And there's the door. What's going to happen? The king of Egypt is going to open this door and I'm going to come out. Joseph probably had those kind of ideas running through his head. That was Joseph's plan to get out of the prison cell. But sadly, however, that is not what happened. For 2 whole years, Joseph remained inside the prison cell, because the chief cupbearer, who promised that he would tell the king of Egypt to let him go, well, the chief cupbearer forgot about Joseph. And so for 2 full years, Joseph remained in prison, despite his earlier hopes for release. And no doubt this caused Joseph great confusion. Pharaoh had the power to release Joseph, so why didn't God? Why did God leave him in that prison cell for 2 whole years? It seemed pointless. Thoughts like these probably ran around Joseph's head. And thoughts like these run around the head of every Christian. You might have asked, why doesn't God use his power to make my life just that little bit easier? Why does God wait to do what he can do now? Why does God sometimes seem to ruin my plans or ideas of how my life should work out? Confusion like this is so much a part of our Christian life. Because, as it says in the book of Isaiah, God says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." I'd like you to go back to your stick man stuck in the prison. Do you believe I can get him out of that prison without interfering with the circle? So, do you think I can get him out? Well, if you think that my wisdom is equal or less than your wisdom, then you're not going to think that I can get him out. Get him out. If I can't get him out, neither can he. However, if you believe my wisdom is greater than your wisdom, then you're going to trust me, aren't you? And here's the results. So it's got him there. It's going to get him out this way. Excellent. He's now outside of the circle. Now, in life, we're all waiting for that aha moment. The moment when all God's actions in this life make sense. The moment when God rescues us from the troubles of this life. However, like with Joseph, this will only happen at the end of our lives. So, a large proportion of your life on earth will be spent waiting. 99% of your life will involve trusting God, trusting that God knows what He is doing better than we understand what is going on. In the meantime, we're simply called to have faith. Faith that trusts God's wisdom, and faith that could trust God's wisdom and power more than our own. So, last question. What does this type of faith look like? What does it look like to trust and keep believing in God when life is confusing and life doesn't make sense? Well, I'd like you to draw the following. I'd like you to draw this picture without taking your pen off the bit of off your bit of paper. So, I'd like you to draw this shape. I'd like you to draw that shape within one swift drawing without taking your pen off the bit of paper. Go. So try and draw it. You might have found that hard if you've not seen that trick done already. But even if I showed you how it was done, you might feel a bit overwhelmed. This is how it's done. A bit too quick, wasn't it? You know, you're probably a bit overwhelmed because I explained it to you in one go. Well, it'd be easier if I just explained it to you one step at a time. So firstly, you do that, then you do that, then you draw the roof, then you draw the rest. It was a lot easier to draw, wasn't it? One step at a time. You know, it wouldn't have looked as glamorous as when I just did it really quickly. But, you know, you just had to do it one step at a time. Now, the Christian life is a lot like you and I trying to draw that picture. Very few of us find it a breeze and swim through without any problems. In fact, nearly every one of God's people, Abraham, David, Jeremiah, the psalmists, Job, Israel, nearly every person in the Bible has found the life of faith difficult. But one thing that unites them all is this: They kept going. One step at a time, one day to the next. They kept going. It may not look impressive, but it was enough to get them through to the end. Despite despairing, so that's how we're to get through the Christian life, one step at a time. Despite despairing at the end of one day, we still need to live out the life of faith the next day. Despite having questions at the end of one week, we keep following God into the next week. Despite the doubts that we've not fully dealt with by the end of the year, we keep living the Christian life the next year. Yes, these people in the Bible and we might not be the shining examples of faith that we'd imagined, people who always find faith to breathe and never question or never doubt or never despair. But the thing all of these people in the Bible have in common is this: they just kept going and didn't give up. And the Bible has a lot commendable to say about that. Last Bible with James chapter 5 verse 10. Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance, and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Even when we face confusing things, we just need to persevere and keep going till the end.